Open with a prayer for our food, which I will do in a minute. One note I wanted to say is I think school choice and public education reform in general is probably the largest lever of how we make Mississippi better. There's 1,000 ways we can make Mississippi better, and many of which I'm passionate about. This is probably number one. When you look at it, what I look at is what do we spend the most money on and what can impact the most people. And you start there and you fix the biggest levers, the things that have the most leverage to make our state better, and you work your way down. Nothing in the state, there is nothing else in the state that we spend $4 billion a year on. $4 billion a year on K-12 education, all in, state, local, federal, etc. And that affects nearly 500,000 people. We have about just shy of 500,000 K-12 students. So when you're looking at making Mississippi better, nothing comes anywhere close to the magnitude of the financial resources we're dedicating to it, or the magnitude of the impact we can have on the individuals that are the future of Mississippi. So as it relates to making Mississippi better, I believe this is the number one thing we need to focus on. With that, let me open with a prayer, and then I'll turn it over to Forrest. Let's pray. God, we do thank you for the opportunity to come here. We thank you for the opportunity to be in a free country where so many aspects of this wonderful country you have given us are free and are consistent with the ways you made the world to operate with the principles of each individual that's made in the image of God, operating consistent with the best wisdom and insight you've given them for how to make their lives better. We pray, Lord, in this situation, as it relates to education, that you would give us wisdom and guidance. This is an area where there's not a lot of choice, not a lot of competition, and not a lot of ability for children and their parents to determine what is best for them. We believe, Lord, you have made a world that is free, a world that operates best when individuals have responsibility and they exercise that responsibility. And we pray that you would give us wisdom in how we can make our public education system in Mississippi more aligned with the principles of how you made the world to work and how you made the world to benefit your creatures that you have put on this earth. Give us wisdom in that. We know we don't have all the answers, but we know, Lord, that we are on a quest and a crusade to make Mississippi a better place, and to do that with the people that are most impressionable and most able to make their lives better. Pray that you give us wisdom in that. I pray that you would bless this session here and all the meetings that took place prior to this and that will take place after as we build toward the 2013 legislative session. Please give every individual involved in that mix a passion, Lord, to make Mississippi better, and a passion to do that as it relates to public education. Pray that you would bless the food before us. Thank you for the many ways you provide for us, and pray that you would give us wisdom and humility in all the things we pursue. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. With that, I'll turn it over to Forrest Thigpen, President of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, too, Joel, for sponsoring our Liberty Luncheon today and the one earlier this month. We usually don't have our Liberty Luncheons quite this close together, but this was a special month, special occasion. A couple of weeks ago, we had a Liberty Luncheon focused on the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, and had some interesting discussion and some aftermath from that I think advanced the debate on that issue and what the state can do, what the options are for Mississippi in dealing with the mandates and the burdens of that act from the federal government. The reason that we are having this meeting today, the reason we chose today to have this luncheon, is that this would have been Milton Friedman's 100th birthday. So we are part of a national network of organizations who are hosting events today to celebrate the legacy of Milton Friedman, at least as it relates to education. That was one of his great passions. He set up a foundation that has continued that pursuit of education reform, and especially introducing competition into the education realm because he knew, as all business people know, competition actually spurs you to increase the quality and efficiency of your service or your product. For some reason, we have a brain block when it comes to public education to think that the education sector is any different And so we're privileged to join with the Friedman Foundation in pursuing that vision of providing parents with the opportunities and the ability to exercise their responsibility to raise their children and educate them as they see fit. Joel Baumgar and Baumgar Corporation has provided a way for us to do that in not only in this luncheon and the previous one on the healthcare issue, but they've been great supporters of ours, and Joel himself personally has been a great supporter, especially of injecting choice and competition into our education system. For those of you who aren't aware of Mississippi Center for Public Policy, we're an independent organization. We're nonprofit. We depend on contributions from people who agree with us on an issue or more and think we're doing a pretty good job at advancing that issue. Our audience is primarily legislators. Sometimes it's the news media. But more and more we're trying to work with providing the public with information and perspective that you need to defend your own liberty, so that we're not just a little organization in Jackson that's trying to shout out from the wilderness, but we have found so many people in Mississippi who already believe the way that we believe. It's just they haven't had the tools to really be able to speak out about it. And so that's one of our great tasks that we love doing. If you would like to help us financially, we would welcome that. It is tax-deductible contributions. And I think there are some, if there aren't envelopes on the table, we will be happy to make that available to you afterwards. This year, our organization's primary focus has been on education reform. At your table, you found a paper that we actually published last year showing the increase in spending per pupil that our state has seen over the last 30 years. An increase as of last year of about 457%. The graph next to that shows you the results of that extra spending, and you see that we have had no results. The ACT, which you could consider as kind of the exit exam for high school, the ACT score has not changed, and in fact, after we published this report last year, the next year's scores, the last year's scores came out, and it was a downtick of another point, had a tenth of a point. So we are the only state that has an ACT average of below 19. We cannot continue to do the same things and expect a different results. So there are a variety of ways, as Joel mentioned, that the state can improve the educational outcomes of children by working to give parents the information and the options they need to exercise their responsibility for educating their children. Although we were unsuccessful during this year's legislative session at passing a charter school, giving a charter school option to parents, we are very pleased with a law that actually will have more impact than that would have. And I'm grateful to some legislators who are here today. Senator Gray Tollison, Chairman of the Senate Education Committee, Senator Nancy Collins, who's the Vice Chairman of Education and actually introduced the bill I'm about to mention, and Representative John Moore, who is the Chairman of the House Education Committee, were all very instrumental in the passage of a bill that I think will have a great impact on every school and every district. And what it did, it will sound simple, but it will have huge results. Our schools and school districts have been labeled for the last few years with labels that really don't mean much. STAR, high performing, successful, academic watch, at risk of failing. I think I left one out. Low performing, thank you. Who knows what those mean? In Florida, a few years ago, they implemented a reform changing their rating system to a grade system, a school report card grade of A through F. And when they did that, there was at least one district or one school that we know of. I'm sure there were others that fit this description. But the parents in that area knew that their school was rated academic watch. But who knows what that means? Does that mean they're so good academically we need to watch them? Or does that mean it's like a tornado watch and we need to be careful? Well, it really was the latter, but nobody really understood that. But then when the new rating system came out and they found out that their school was rated D, they rose up and demanded change. The next year that district was a C, the year after it was a B, and the year after that it was an A. So simple transparency in our grading system will go a long way at helping parents and taxpayers understand what's at stake in their school system. So this bill that was introduced by Senator Collins and supported by Gray Tollison and John Moore and the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker, this bill will now apply that same system to Mississippi. So beginning next month, when the new school ratings come out for this past school year, the new ratings will be A through F, A, B, C, D, F. So you'll know at least the rating that's being given to them. Now, even that rating is going to be inflated for a lot of schools, because what we found last year is that schools that were rated successful really weren't successful by most people's standards. If you think we've got a successful school, in fact, there was one district that put out banners and more than 100 placards out in front of their schools. We are now a successful district. The only way they were able to be a successful district is they barely reached above where they had been the year before, still at the very bottom rung of what counts as successful. And we believe that there were some numbers manipulated that allowed them to be rated successful. We're looking into that more. But even so, what they'll have to do this year, if they want to have the same celebration, we are a C district. And who's really going to be celebrating that? Because most people think, well, we have a successful district. That was one of the arguments against charter schools. We have a successful district. Let's not let charter schools in here. We're successful. But the range of successful goes from almost failing, actually, to some schools that are actually very good, but they didn't improve from last year. So even if they're the top schools, they have to improve from year to year to get the top ratings. So we will have that rating system. But again, the scoring system, the way they calculate those ratings, will not be changed for the better. It actually will be changed for the worse. Because this month, our State Board of Education voted to no longer consider dropout rates in rating the schools. So the schools can now have whatever dropout rate, whatever high school completion rate, they call it, that they want, and that will not count against them. Won't count for them, won't count against them. And so the changes that are being made need close examination, and they need for the public to understand what's at stake and what's being done to our rating system that keeps us from actually knowing how good our schools are really doing. Lance Izumi has studied this issue from a national perspective. He's looked at a variety of states and their practices. He's looked at some districts in our state, which you'll hear about in just a minute. And his perspective that he brings is one that is so valuable to us and so timely that we're thrilled to have him here today. He is the Senior Director of Education Studies at the Pacific Research Institute. He's an accomplished author of books and articles, and even has some movie credits to his name. You'll see a little bit of an extra on a movie that you'll see at the end of his presentation today, just a 4-minute clip. He's on the California equivalent of our Community College Board, and he serves in the California State Military Reserve. He was a speechwriter for Governor Dick Majan of California and Ed Meese when he was Attorney General of the United States. So, in short, he's a smart guy with a lot of experience and a lot of wisdom, and we're privileged to have him here today. Please welcome Lance Izumi.
Well, thank you very much, Forrest, for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate it, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here in Mississippi. regardless of what the weather is like. It's actually hotter in Sacramento, where I'm from. It's actually supposed to be, I think, 105 today. So actually, I'm coming to a cool place. So, the Mississippi Center for Public Policy has been very generous in hosting me here, and it's so great to see all of you come out for this celebration for Milton Friedman's 100th anniversary and to discuss his legacy, especially in education. In the introduction, Forrest mentioned that I had spent some time as a speechwriter for Attorney General Ed Meese in the Reagan administration and for the governor of our state as the chief speechwriter. So I always tell folks that behind every great man, there's a little Japanese guy in a bow tie at a keyboard. I was actually talking to all my new friends here in the Tea Party up at my table, and we were actually talking not about politics or taxes, we were actually talking about Scotland. And turns out I'm a huge fan of Scotland. In fact, I got married in Scotland. I actually got married in an 18th century Scottish castle in full kilt and regalia. I actually belonged to the Caledonian Club of Sacramento. So if you want to actually see any kind of cultural dissonance, is to look at a Japanese guy in a kilt, So I always go to the Scottish Highland Games in Sacramento and in the Bay Area. And so at the Sacramento Games, I'm often a volunteer, so I also take tickets from people, And so people come up to me, and it's as if I had never heard this one before, right? They tell me, you know something? You don't look Scottish. If you've heard that line 100 times, you have to have a comeback, right? So what I tell them is that, oh, really? Actually, you know something? Didn't you hear? Scotland went broke, and Japan bought them up. And I'm actually the representative from Sony. So, anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I've enjoyed meeting all the folks in Mississippi so far. My visit is too short. I hope that I can stay longer the next time. Again, thank you to the Mississippi Center for Public Policy for hosting me here today. I'm here to talk about education, and first off, I want to congratulate Senator Tolleson and Senator Collins and Representative Moore for the excellent work you did on that bill that Forrest talked about. I mean, that's incredibly important, what you did, because what I'm going to be talking about is our issues of transparency, issues of information, so that parents and the public can have a better idea about how their children are doing in the schools, and anything that can be done to give a clearer picture to parents and the public as to how the schools are doing is so incredibly important. So what all of you did in the legislature was a terrific victory, I think, for the people of Mississippi. So my congratulations to all of you. I think one of the most scariest things, you've heard how, one of the scary thing is for somebody to come to an occasion like this and say, I'm here from Washington, and I'm here to help you. I think the only thing more scary than that is to say, I'm from California, and I've come here to help. So, but don't hold that against me. We're here, as I say, to first of all, to mark the anniversary for Milton Friedman's birthday. But, there's also a second anniversary that's very important. And that's the fact that 50 years ago, in 1962, this is the 50th anniversary of the publication of a book that really changed the political dialogue here in the United States. Milton Friedman published Capitalism and Freedom. And in that work, it was really the first time he really popularized the issue of school choice, and it actually became, an education issue after he published Capitalism and Freedom. I won't read all these quotes, but one of the things that Professor Friedman said when he talked about whether government should be the only provider of education here in this country, he said that governments could require a minimum level of schooling financed by giving parents vouchers redeemable for a specific maximum sum per child per year if spent on approved educational services. Now again, that's 1962. And he went on to say that parents, what would be the effect? Parents would then be free to spend this sum on any additional sum they themselves provide on purchasing educational services from approved institutions of choice. And what kinds of entities would this be? Well, they would be educational services that could be rendered by private enterprises, operated for profit, or by non-profit institutions, and the government would be relegated to just setting some minimum standards. Now, that's obviously a revolutionary thing to say in 1962. And but now here it is 50 years later, and look at how there's been a change in the educational landscape across this country, right? We now have all kinds of different school choice programs operating in all kinds of states, all throughout the United States. We have voucher programs that are, anywhere that range the spectrum from nearly universal type voucher programs to targeted voucher programs that give every child the ability to go to the public or private school of his or her choice. We have tax credit and scholarship programs that give individuals or corporations tax credits from state taxes for making donations to nonprofit organizations that in turn make private school scholarships available to children, especially from low-income families. Let's see here. I'm going ahead of myself here. All right. And there are also programs that allow individual parents to receive tax credits or tax deductions from their state income taxes for expenses such as private school tuition or books and supplies or transportation. In addition, many states now allow charter schools, which, as all of you know, because charter schools is such a huge issue in Mississippi, are independent schools that are freed of many of the regulations that hamper regular public schools in exchange for greater accountability for results. I actually wrote a book a few years ago called Free to Learn, Lessons from Model Charter Schools. And this gives some of the lessons that we've learned in California, where we have about 1,000 charter schools. And in fact, the first chapter is a profile of a charter school which has grown from the time I profiled it a few years ago to today to be the top performing school in the entire state of California. And so it's not just a top-performing charter school, it's a top-performing school. And where's that school located? The school isn't located in Beverly Hills or Malibu or the Silicon Valley. It's located in inner-city Oakland, and with an incredibly challenging demographic that it has to deal with. And yet that school has gone on to score on our 1,000-point scale on our accountability system nearly 1,000. And scoring much better than all of the wealthier districts in California. In addition to charter schools, there are new digital alternatives, online schools, virtual schools. I've also written about that. If you're interested on that, we can all have a conversation later. And finally, there's homeschooling, which is an increasingly popular choice option for parents, which has become even more appealing because of these online tools that are now available for parents to use. And it's no longer, just sitting home, going over worksheets with the kids. Now you are able to use these online tools. For example, one of the popular things that you see across the country is the use of virtual charter schools to homeschool your child. So you have companies like K-12 Incorporated, Bill Bennett's organization that provides virtual learning tools to parents so they can homeschool their kids, but still are within the umbrella of a charter school. So there are all kinds of really innovative alternatives that are springing up out there, and which is one of the reasons why it's good to have a good charter school law in your state. Now, the question then, there are all these different school choice tools that have become available, and yet there's still this fundamental debate about whether school choice is a good thing or not. And opponents of school choice have often argued that parental choice options, such as especially vouchers, but also obviously you've had this discussion about charter schools in your state, other types of school choice options. Are they really going to result in better performance by the kids? Because that's one of the key criteria for enacting any kind of reform, is that it's going to have an impact on the performance of children in the schools. And so opponents of school choice will say that no, it doesn't have that type of impact. Even some supporters of school choice have limited their support of choice programs to only those programs that focus on low-income kids or on kids with special needs, those very narrow populations of the students out there. And so I'm going to talk about that as well. What did Milton Friedman have to say about this type of thing? Well, he said that empowering parents would generate a competitive education market which would lead to a burst of innovation, improvement, as competition has done in so many other areas. To those who supported narrow choice options, such as those only limited to low-income families, Milton Friedman said that these programs would help the poor, but it would not produce a real reform of the educational system. He wanted universal choice programs because he said that choice programs designed only for the poor would eventually become a poor program. And so, now those are, I think, are right-on observations by Milton Friedman. So what are the actual empirical evidence? What's the empirical evidence for his conclusions, and what has been the research since his publication, for example, of Capitalism and Freedom? Well, now opponents of school choice will say that there's no evidence to show that vouchers, for example, have any kind of positive effect on the achievement of students. Barry Lynn, who's the executive director of the Americans United for Separation of Church and State, which I'm sure a few of you have heard about, has said that there's no evidence that vouchers make a difference. But is that really true? Not really according to the best evidence available. Now, you'll often hear, in the popular press about, this study or that study on vouchers and other kinds of choice programs. But I'm here to, say that, when those articles come out in the press, it's important to really try and find out what types of studies those really are. And the best studies are actually those that compare an experimental group or versus a control group. That is a group that is actually receiving the experimental treatment, let's say vouchers, and a group that is a control group that is not receiving it. So there are actually been studies done which has this what they call random assignment methodology, which is the gold standard in scientific experimentation, and that's usually done when you look at kids who are trying to apply for a choice program using a lottery system. So some kids win the lottery, right, and some kids lose the lottery. Those of you who have seen, any of you seen the movie Waiting for Superman? Okay, Waiting for Superman was a movie done by actually Al Gore's director of An Inconvenient Truth, but then he made this great film on education where he profiled kids who were trying to get into going from low-performing public schools into better-performing charter schools, and he showed how difficult it was for them to get in because there were so limited spaces oftentimes, and so they often had to participate in a lottery system. Some of those kids made it. Other kids who applied didn't make it. Well, you have there your scientific scheme because you have your experimental group, the kids who made it into the charter school, and those who didn't, those who lost out on the lottery. Now, when you look at the studies based on that type of design, what you find out, at least for example in vouchers, that there have been 10 studies done by national organizations and national academic institutions on vouchers, and 9 out of 10 of them have shown that kids have improved their performance. The experimental group, the kids receiving vouchers, have improved their performance after receiving their vouchers because they're going to better performing schools. And these studies cover voucher programs in places like Milwaukee, Washington, D.C., New York City, and several other places. And not surprisingly, because the kids were performing better, the parents were more satisfied. So in surveys that were done, follow-up surveys, we found that the parents who were receiving vouchers were much more satisfied with their new schools than with the schools that they had been going to, that they'd been sending their kids to. And the parents felt that the kids were doing better in terms of discipline, and safety, and lots of other different types of indicators. So therefore, of course, they're going to be happier. Now, if you're interested in seeing, kind of a summary of all of this research, you should go. Now, Forrest had mentioned the Friedman Foundation. They put out a great study in March of last year, called A Win-Win Solution by Dr. Greg Forster. So I would highly recommend that you look at the Friedman Foundation website and then take a look at that study by Dr. Forster, A Win-Win Solution. So if school choice, especially like vouchers, for example, really do improve the performance of kids in the classroom, what is the argument for, against a universal voucher or choice program? Well, Dr. Jay Green, who is the chairman of the University of Arkansas Department of Education Reform, has this great observation where he says the main source of political opposition and the most serious source of political opposition to expanding choice comes not from the unions and all the typical folks that we think would be opposing school choice. He says the real problem is basically the well-to-do suburbanites who oppose it because they think their schools are pretty good. They think that the arrangements they have are pretty good and they don't want to mess it up by monkeying around with the status quo and inserting school choice into the equation. So now his observation is that the situation is not nearly as good as they think it is. And that's actually been our finding for my work at the Pacific Research Institute. Now, we looked at achievement data in California schools in middle class and affluent areas. And, places, again, like Beverly Hills, Malibu, and places like that. And we found hundreds of regular public schools in these areas where large percentages of students failed to perform at the proficient level on our state English and math exams. Further, we had huge percentages of the students at our high schools in those middle class and affluent areas failed to achieve at the college-ready level on exams administered by our California State University system. So they were not prepared for college. So now the important point for all of you here is that this is not just a California problem. If it were, I wouldn't be here. It's a national problem. Certainly, I think eventually you'll see it's a Mississippi problem. The Third Way, which is a Democrat-leaning think tank, actually found that on national tests, only 30% of fourth graders and just 28% of eighth graders at middle-class schools score at the proficient level in reading. And you had similar percentages on the national math examinations. Also, too, just 38% of middle-class high school seniors go immediately on to a four-year college. And only 28% of middle-class high school graduates will actually earn a four-year college degree by the time they are 26. So, really only a small percentage of our middle-class and more affluent students are actually doing well according to what all of us would consider to be doing well. Now, hold on a second. There we go. Now, one way to see how children who are not from low-income families are doing is to actually look at the scores on what's called the National Assessment for Educational Progress, the NAEP examination, which is often called the nation's report card. Now, virtually all states administer this NAEP exam, including Mississippi, in the core subjects. And you can dissect these national results based on whether the students taking this examination were eligible for the National School Lunch Program. Now, that's often used as a proxy for whether kids are poor or not. All right? If you're eligible for the National Free and Reduced Lunch Program, then you are, you will be probably classified as low income and or socioeconomically disadvantaged is the proper term. And those who aren't eligible for the lunch program are not disadvantaged. And so, now, many people outside of Mississippi, like people from California, for example, might believe that the reason Mississippi performs relatively poorly on student performance indicators is because of the significant number of socioeconomically disadvantaged children who live in your state. But if you look at Mississippi students who are not eligible for the National School Lunch Program and therefore are not classified as disadvantaged, and you look at their performance on the latest NAEP reading and math examinations, what you find is pretty unfortunate. On the fourth grade NAEP reading examination, 60% of non-disadvantaged Mississippi students failed to perform at the proficient level. Now, proficiency means full mastery of the subject material and is the goal of all students. That's what all states are focusing on, is to make sure these kids are at proficient. Now, the results weren't much better among older students. On the 8th grade NAEP examination for reading, 61% of the non-disadvantaged Mississippi students failed to hit proficiency. Now in math, you had more than half of the 4th graders, 53% of those non-disadvantaged students not making proficiency. And on the 8th grade NAEP math examination, 65% of non-disadvantaged Mississippi students failed to achieve at proficiency. All right. So it's not just an income problem here, right? Now, this NAEP data tells you about statewide performance amongst students. It cannot be broken down into the school district levels because of the way, and I won't go into the reasons, but because of the way they actually test, the way the test is actually administered. But for district and school level results, people actually usually look to the results on their own state examinations. And here in Mississippi, you have the Mississippi Curriculum Test, the MCT, and schools and states in different states, have different levels of how challenging their own state examination is. And if you look at the results on the Mississippi test, they seem to indicate that Mississippi's testing program is not as challenging as compared to tests in other states. So if you compare, let's see. Hold on 1 second here. Yes. Now, if you compare the proficiency rates of the NAEP examinations that I was just talking about with the Mississippi Curriculum Test, the MCT, for students who are not disadvantaged, on the MCT fourth grade reading examination, only 27% of non-disadvantaged students failed to score at the proficient level, which means basically 3/4 of the kids on the Mississippi test scored proficient or above. But recall, on the NAEP examination, basically the opposite was true, that 60% of those non-disadvantaged students failed to hit proficiency. And again, on the MCT 8th grade reading examination, only 32% of non-disadvantaged students failed to hit proficiency, but it was nearly double on the NAEP examination. This disparity is apparent in mathematics. On the 4th grade MCT exam, less than 1/4 of the non-disadvantaged students failed to score at the proficient level. In contrast, more than half of the non-disadvantaged Mississippi 4th graders failed to hit the proficiency mark on math. And in the 8th grade, there's the biggest gap. In the MCT, only 20%, 1 in 5, of non-disadvantaged students failed to score at proficiency. In comparison, 65%, almost 2/3 of Mississippi 8th graders failed to make the proficient level on the NAEP exam. So what these comparisons indicate is that there's a great possibility that middle-class students and their schools in Mississippi may not be doing quite as good as people think they are. You can always say that there's going to be some difference in results because different tests. There might be some slight differences in the things they do test, but there's something going on when you have such huge disparities between these proficiency levels. Now, when one looks at the districts themselves, it's again you have to remember that you can't use the NAEP data at the district level. But let's look at how some of the more affluent districts here in Mississippi do on your MCT examination. Like in DeSoto County School District, only 4% of the non-disadvantaged 4th graders and only 6% of non-disadvantaged 8th graders failed to score at the proficient level on the reading examination. And these percentages are nearly identical on the MCT math exams. In Jackson County School District, only 5% of non-disadvantaged 4th graders and 10% of non-disadvantaged 8th graders failed to hit the proficient mark on the MCT reading exams. And the percentages were similar on the math, MCT math. Oops, okay. So one of the things, though, so if you have at the district level and you have those types of numbers, then and you can't bore down with the NAEP examination data to the district level, then how do you know whether those numbers on the MCT for DeSoto County, Jackson County, maybe Rankin County, Lowndes County, whatever, are actually as good as they appear to be? One way you can tell this is by actually looking at something called the Global Report Card. Now, this is put out by Dr. Jay Green, who I mentioned before, from the University of Arkansas and some of his colleagues, and it was funded by and put out by the George W. Bush Institute. And what this Global Report Card does is that it allows anybody in this room to be able to go log in and see how their individual school district or any school district in the entire country, how that district is doing against our global competitors, a group of 25 developed countries around the world and individual countries within that group. So when he did this, what he found is that actually, when you look at some of these well-to-do districts, that actually in the international comparisons, they are not doing very well at all. So using the global report card, we can compare the performance of students in DeSoto County, for example, and other similar Mississippi districts with their peers. And as I say, that comparison is far less rosy than what the MCT scores in those districts would seem to indicate. Now, when compared to the students in developed countries, more than half of the students in these countries perform better than the average DeSoto student in reading. Even more troubling, 2/3 of the international students, 67%, perform better than the average DeSoto student in mathematics. And when you compare DeSoto students with specific countries, the results are even worse. For example, our neighbors to the north, the Canadians, perform much better. More than 6 out of 10 Canadian students, or 63%, perform better than the average DeSoto student in reading. And more than 3/4 of the Canadian students, 76%, perform better than the average DeSoto student in mathematics. Now, in education circles, for those of you who are in education, you know that one of the hot countries to compare yourself to, or our country to, are the Finns. People on both left and right have something to, admire about the Finns, and so anyway, Finland is often looked to as being, a country that we should emulate in some way. Well, it turns out that more than 7 out of 10 Finnish students, 72%, perform better in reading than the average DeSoto student. Singapore is the highest performing math country in the world, and more than 8 out of 10 Singaporean students, 82%, perform better in math than the average DeSoto student. Now, DeSoto, I don't want to just beat up on DeSoto. Well, let's beat up on somebody else. I'm sorry about that. Now, take Jackson County, for example. In reading, the Jackson County, the average Jackson County student performs better than just more than half of the international group. Now, that's okay. It's not great, but at least it's okay. They perform better than half. But in math, about 6 out of 10 of the international students perform better than the average Jackson County student in reading. Now, when you compare them with the Canadians, 57% of the Canadian students perform better in reading than the average Jackson County student, and 68% of the Canadians perform better in math. Against the Finns, the average Jackson County student fails to perform better in reading than 66% of the Finnish students, and more than 3/4 of the Singaporean students perform better in math than the average student in that district. Okay, I've done some calculations for Lowndes County. Is that how you pronounce it? Lowndes County? Sorry about that. With a name like Izumi, you can't, So, and also with Rankin County. The Mississippi Center has been so good as to condense my PowerPoint presentation for you that you should all have a copy of it so you can refer to it on your in the future. Now, the conclusion, therefore, is that the benefits of school choice, which I outlined at the start of my presentation, are important just as much for middle-class parents as they are for the parents of low-income children. States, I include California, other states, where you rest on the illusory laurels of high, let's say, MCT scores, will not get students in DeSoto and other similar districts ready to compete with our increasingly global marketplace, right? Our political leaders incessantly tell us that we need to have students who perform at a world-class level, right? How many times have you heard that, right? Probably too many times to count, right? But when do they ever tell you, really, in your backyard, how those students actually are performing against the global competition? Well, here it is. And what you find is that the students in our supposedly better schools are lagging behind their foreign peers. For middle-class parents, taxpayers, and their elected representatives, the biggest enemy is complacency based on a lack of information and a broader perspective. We should not accept at face value student achievement indicators that are either misleading or tell only part of the story. To do so would accept a future of mediocrity and decline for our children. And as I've tried to show today, public schools in our comfortable suburbs are often not as good as people think they are. And if they are not, then the answer is to give all parents school choice options. That's why it's really encouraging to see places like Louisiana, Indiana, Wisconsin enact large programs that make vouchers, for example, available to not just low-income parents, but also to middle-class parents as well. Across your state line in Louisiana, Bobby Jindal signed legislation that gives vouchers to more than half of Louisiana students, including middle-class students. In Indiana, up to 600,000 students will now be eligible for vouchers, including middle-class students. In Milwaukee, they expanded the Milwaukee program to include middle-income students. In fact, there was more and bigger school choice legislation passed in 2011 than in the entire history of school choice in this country in 1 year. And so I think that, despite all of the mass protests that you've seen, the intimidation of elected officials, recall elections, dumping tens of millions of dollars into disinformation campaigns by the opponents of school choice, the result is still that this has failed to stop the wave of choice reform that is sweeping the country. Now, this wave can become a tsunami if America's vast middle class can get beyond Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon view that all children are above average. Unfortunately, they are not. I mean, at least in the way they perform. Maybe not inherently, but they are not. So we need to really heed Milton Friedman's call for school choice, not just for some, but for all our children. Yeah. And based on that, recommendation, what we did at Pacific Research Institute was to actually go to a place where there is school choice for every single child. We went to Sweden. When I mentioned the country Sweden, what does everybody think? They probably think IKEA, and then think of socialism or Volvo. So Sweden is one of the most socialistic countries in the Western world. Yet, in the education marketplace, they're actually one of the most market-oriented because they actually have a universal voucher program which they instituted in the 1990s and which is now supported by the entire political spectrum, including the Socialist Party, and it is operating, exquisitely over there. And we did a film of that, which a couple years ago, which incredibly was actually posted on the website of the New York Times. And so I'm going to show that short film to you. It's only 4 minutes, so hope you'll indulge me. And I think Jason is going to put the lights there. In his announcement of Chicago School Superintendent Arne Duncan as his new Secretary of Education, Barack Obama said that Washington is stuck in the same tired when I narrated this film about schools and... Actually, if we can't speed up the soundtrack, then we don't have to do that. You know how... Okay. Try one more time. In his announcement of Chicago School Superintendent Arne Duncan as his new Secretary of Education, Barack Obama said that Washington is stuck in the same tired debates that have left schools and parents to fend for themselves. He identified one of the supposedly tired debates as vouchers against the status quo. The new president, however, should take a look at Sweden, where parties of the left, center, and right all support the country's universal voucher program, which has effectively defeated the status quo.
It's very simple. It says that the public is paying, but we open up the possibility for others than the local community to run schools.
To simplify it, we implemented competition in education.
In the U.S., reformers of different political stripes have called for education funding, such as federal dollars for disadvantaged students, to follow the child to whichever public school the child attends, rather than simply sending money directly to states or school districts. Why not let that money follow a child to a private school? Sweden is doing just that.
Anybody can use their voucher to choose any school.
Because of financial limitations, most American parents send their children to their local public school, regardless of whether or not that school meets their children's needs.
Education is so important that you cannot actually leave it to just one producer. Because we know from all monopolies that monopoly systems do not fulfill all wishes.
With funding attached to their children, Swedish parents can choose between public schools and a range of private schools that span the spectrum of educational philosophies. For instance, the private independent international English school not only emphasizes the teaching of English, it also stresses high expectations, a tough love style of instruction, and constant assessment of student knowledge and skills.
The students perform very well here. We are the highest achieving school in this region of Sweden.
The school has a diverse student body, which isn't surprising since Sweden has roughly the same proportion of immigrants as the United States. In contrast to the International English School's disciplined atmosphere, the Via Emilia School in Stockholm has a more relaxed approach.
Children must be able to take the time they need to figure it out on their own. It's not a matter of how strict you are or if you are trying to force knowledge into them. Knowledge has to come from within the child.
Because the new private schools have been able to meet the needs of children and parents, there is widespread support for the voucher program.
As a mentor to 16 individual students, I know that their parents are very grateful to have the opportunity to send their kids here and to receive the quality of education that they're getting. And would it be the same if they had to pay for it? Probably not.
I have friends that live in New York and they pay so much money to go to school. Like, why do you, or go to preschool? Why don't you just go to a school? I think it's crazy. I think it's really crazy.
Back in the United States, Barack Obama wants to focus on reforming the public school system. But lots of well-intentioned people have been trying to do that for a long time. And too many public schools continue to produce students not proficient in reading or math. With no escape ticket, such as a voucher, these students remain trapped in failing schools. And that's a waste of lives.
Kids should never, ever have to stay in a school if the school is lousy. The right of the kid is to get a good education. If the public sector cannot offer it, he or she should have a right to go somewhere else.
New York City spends more than $13,000 per student. If some or all of that money followed the student to a public or private school chosen by parents, that would, as President Obama might say, give hope a chance for all of America's children. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going to ask Forrest to come up, and I think we have some time for some Q&A.
John Moore.
I'm going to ask this question to the chairman of the Senate Education Committee. The testing difference between the MCT and the NAEP test, why are we doing both? I mean, why aren't we just testing NAEP and not using the MCT? Is there a reason?
Well, I can offer an opinion. I clearly defer to the legislators to can answer that as well. I know that the reason why states often use both a state examination and NAEP is because NAEP is oftentimes viewed as kind of a backup test in terms of like as a check on, well, here's what our state test is showing. Well, how does it show? How do we rank up against a national standard, a national sample of students? Now, the thing of it is that as I say, because of the way NAEP is administered to students in Mississippi and each other state, you cannot compare Jackson County with Hinds County and all that at the district level. You can just see how the students in Mississippi are doing compared to, let's say, the students in New Jersey or Arkansas or wherever. But so that's why you probably have both tests, because the Mississippi test, or whatever state test a state adopts, you can bore down to that school level and look to see how the local elementary or high school is doing, how the local district is doing, and so that it's really one of the reasons why.
Yeah, NAEP is a representative sample of students. It's sort of like taking a survey or a poll, where it's a representative sample of students from a state. So they don't have enough of a sample from each district to be able to rate the districts or the schools.
Go ahead.
Senator Hill.
Just as a backup on the question that Representative Moore asked, about 15 years ago, Mississippi, before they moved into the MCT, before they moved into the MCT about 15 years ago, they used national norm reference-based achievement testing in the elementary schools and in the junior highs, and used the ACT as a basis in the high school. And then we moved away from that national norm reference testing, which would have been more in line with the NAEP test, and moved into the MCT about 15 years ago. And that's when we actually lost the national base, because we either used Iowa Test of Basic Skills, Stanford, several national norm reference-based tests that we used, where we did have a broad national comparison rather than just these randomly picked in 4th and 8th grade to take the NAEP. So it's been, where we've been testing in a bottle, it's been about 15 years to my recognition, to my recollection.
Thank you.
Douglas. Yeah, Dr. Looney, could you address the parents in DeSoto County who are fearful that it's not necessarily that they think that their school district is so good, but that the advent of a school voucher system would inundate their school district? Maybe it's not so great, but it would be made worse by an influx of students from more disadvantaged districts.
Well, I think that's a very good question. California in the 1990s had two statewide initiatives for universal voucher systems. And when I would do radio or TV and do call-in, that was invariably one of the first questions that I would get, is like, if you're from one of these types of districts, at least in a California setting, well, wouldn't that, quote unquote, mess up the schools, in that district? And actually, my response is always that, well, yes or no, if you thought that, the imposition of a universal voucher system would keep the supply constant, right? Right now you have a set number of private schools in Mississippi and California, but if you have a universal voucher, that's going to change. It's not as if like, okay, all of the kids who are in Hinds County are all of a sudden now going to want to go to those few private schools in Jackson County or wherever it is. What you're going to find is you're going to have a huge explosion in the number of schools available to kids in their local communities, in their local neighborhoods. So, for example, in Sweden, in that film, now you probably couldn't see the subtitle for the Swedish man who was speaking, the older gentleman. He's the governor of Stockholm, a guy named Per Unckel. There's a name for you. Yeah, Per Unckel. And he was a former minister of education in the Swedish federal government, the central government, when they passed the voucher law. And one of the things he told me was that in Stockholm, before the advent of the voucher law, there was only one private school for the entire city of Stockholm. And so it was nearly impossible for anybody to have choice, regardless of whether they were middle or affluent or whether they were poor. But ever since the advent of the voucher law, because they allow, for example, for-profit companies to come in, and they have an incentive to get clientele, right? So they have established schools all throughout Sweden, not just in middle class areas, but also in poorer areas. The school that I went to in where you saw the kids who are in a little bit more free flowing atmosphere, they're in not the best area in Sweden, and also the other school is not in the best suburb of Sweden, and yet they are going to those schools. They're not going to the schools necessarily where you have tons of wealthy people, just because parents, when they are deciding where to send their kid, they'd rather send their kid to a neighborhood school, if possible, because of all kinds of reasons, for transportation, schedules, otherwise. And so what a universal voucher does, it creates markets in those neighborhoods where there were no markets before. So here in Mississippi, for example, I know based upon the experience of other states and localities that do have more universal voucher programs, what you find is that pastors in churches, Baptist, Catholic, whatever, whose congregants didn't have the money to start up a private school attached to the church, will now start one up, because now the congregants have the money to be able to put the kids in the school that they go to on Sunday, right? So what you're going to find is this burgeoning of supply to take care of those issues. And again, the point is that in Sweden, They have a lottery system where anyone can go to any school in the country. If they really want to drive across the country to go to a school, they can enter a lottery. But the reality is that people want to go to what's very close, and as long as there are quality alternatives close at hand, which is promoted by a universal system, they're going to choose those alternatives.
By the way, in Florida, there was a study that was done funded by the federal government, so not an advocacy group, a couple of years ago that showed where, in Florida, where they have a lot of options, charter schools, some vouchers, some tax credit scholarships, others, they found that the kids who were, quote, left behind in the regular schools, where there was a little bit of competition, those kids who were, quote, left behind actually did better than kids who had no competition. But what they also found was where there's a lot of competition, the kids who were left behind do a lot better. So the more competition there is, the more all of the schools improve. Where there's a little bit of competition, it improves a little bit.
How does one get the school administration department to want to allow competition? And I'll tell you that I'm from Jackson County, and I actually ran for school board this year for the Pascagoula School District, and the school district says, we don't want charter schools because our schools are wonderful. Well, that's not true. So how does...
Well, I think that one of the things that, there are several arguments you can make. First of all, if there are a lot of parents like you, or members of the public like you, who see that the Jackson County schools are not as good as people think they are, there is a demand out there. Secondly, to tell the officials there is that, look, it's not like it's going to hurt you, right? What Forrest said just right now, that competition actually improves the performance of regular public schools, is absolutely true. I gave you those statistics, those citations for the studies at the beginning of my presentation about the impact of vouchers on those students who received the vouchers. Well, what I didn't tell you, because I'm short on time, is the fact that there are those types of very rigorous studies that have been done to see how the vouchers and other school choice mechanisms impact the performance of public schools, regular public schools. And what you find is that the overwhelming majority of those types of studies find that the performance of public schools, as Forrest indicated, rise based upon the competition level that they're experiencing from the voucher or the choice schools. In Sweden, one of the things that Governor Unckel told me is that when he talks to headmasters now, because you have a universal voucher system that they must deal with, it's incentivized them to look at how the private schools are attracting their clientele. So he said to me that headmasters at the Swedish schools now say that, well, if they can do it, so can we. So that's a totally different attitude than to say, we're okay, we don't need it, right? They have improved. It's been the voucher system has been a rising tide that's lifted all boats, both in the private sector and in the public sector. And so Sweden is overall a better performing country now because of that system. And so I think that for the public system, there is not as much to fear as they believe, if they respond to the signals that are being sent out by the market. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Does class size change with there are more options? Because one of the problems is established school administrators say, well, you're going to take away our good students, you're going to take away our money, everything else. But they always tell us we need smaller class size.
Right. No, yeah, that's absolutely true. And it's I know administrators are often put between a rock and hard place because of that requirement. I have several observations about that. Is that I've been a huge opponent of reducing class sizes, and the basic reason is because there's very little empirical evidence to show that reducing class sizes by itself does anything to improve the performance of students. Because if you think about it from a logical point of view, right, let's say you had 40 kids in a classroom with one really excellent teacher, right? Now you reduce class sizes to 20 kids per student, 20 20 kids per teacher. Well, 20 of those kids are now going to have a great experience with that one excellent teacher. Who are those other 20 going to get? Maybe they get a teacher who's not as great as that former teacher, right? Maybe they get a lousy teacher. So what happens is that overall, you don't see improvement among students because there are fewer students who are now being exposed to the really excellent teachers. And in fact, in California, where we have a huge class size reduction program, it's one of the few programs, though, that the state actually researched to see whether it was working or not. And what they found out under its own research is that class size reduction has no impact on the level of student performance. And yet we continue to spend billions of dollars because, unfortunately, our politicians are too afraid to dismantle the program and send that money to a place that would produce better results, like choice.
Well, my question was a follow-up question to the previous one, and he answered it. It had to do with competition, and I'm concerned about teachers and their longevity when they have a large number of students in a classroom versus 20 or 30.
I mean, I think that, teachers would always like to have smaller sizes. It's just the way it is. And I can totally understand if I were in their shoes. I will say this, is that with the new tools that are becoming available to teachers, such as online learning. Now, online learning doesn't just have to be, kids who are homeschooled and using a virtual charter school to, get their educational services. You can have all these online programs in currently existing brick and mortar school sites, and it allows teachers to have, to be able to teach more efficiently and more effectively if it's used right. So, for example, in the book that I did last year called Short Circuited on Online Education, I interviewed some folks who have a software program for mathematics that uses it's very funny, I wish I had a clip of it. They use an animated penguin to teach kids mathematical concepts. No English text, so you can use it for English language and English language learners. And so, anyway, this program is used in regular public schools and makes the teachers much more efficient in their use of time and who they actually spend that time with in terms of like the kids who are really having problems. And so in a district like the Santa Ana school district, which is in Orange County, which is actually, you wouldn't think this, but is actually the most Hispanic district in the entire, not only in California, but I believe in the entire country. The schools that are using this online program are doing incredibly well, with mathematics on our pretty difficult state tests. And so you're having 80 to 90% of the kids scoring at a proficient level, and all these kids are often English language learners. They're low-income kids, and yet they're performing at the level of performance that kids in Palo Alto next to Stanford University are doing. And they have oftentimes 30 or more students. In fact, the principal has said that, hey, we could teach 40 or more or so, and because it makes us so much more efficient with our time. So,
coming from California, where you have a strong unionized base of teachers, how has charter schools been received by the union, teachers union?
Well, that's a very good question, and yes, it's true. We do have an extremely strong union base in the education system in California. In fact, the California Teachers Association, which is the state affiliate of the National Education Association, is the highest spending lobby in California. And you put together all of the business associations, the Chamber of Commerce, the Manufacturers Association, they don't hold a candle to the State Teachers Association. And so it makes it very difficult for the charter schools in terms of trying to fend off bad legislation, for example. What also happens is that having such a strong teachers union present in our state makes it difficult when parents at a school want to convert an existing public school to a charter school, because the union will fight them like crazy. In California, we have something called a parent trigger law, so that if parents can basically take over a really poor performing school and turn it into a charter school, but they often face such incredible resistance from the local teachers union, the state teachers union, that only the most determined parents can actually get through the process. Again, and I am a huge supporter of charter schools. I wrote a book on charter schools, right? And yet that is the reason why, on your question, why I'm such a huge supporter of vouchers and other types of bigger school choice tools, because it is often so difficult to try and get a charter, right? Now, if you're a parent in whether it's Jackson County or Hinds County or something like that, and you're finding opposition by whatever group doesn't want you to have a charter school, well, it takes a special breed of parent to really knock heads constantly, day after day, week after week, to try and get a charter. And in California, if you don't get the charter approved by the local board of education, you can appeal to the county. And if you don't get the county board to approve it, you can appeal to the state's board of education. But how many parents are really going to have that kind of stamina? Some, but not many. So much easier for you as an individual parent to take your voucher, for example, like in Sweden, and say, okay, my local public school isn't doing it for me, but there's a school over there, the International English School, which has high results and is offering the type of discipline that I want for my kids. I want to go there. That's it. End of story. Right? No getting petitions, no getting approvals from entrenched interest groups, no opposition from the it's all finished. Okay? So while charter schools are good, something is great, and it's not that.
Thank you, Lance.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lance. Thank you all for being here. If you have any questions for us, we'll be around for a few minutes. We do have another appointment we have to get Lance to, so if you have a question for him, ignore all your friends around you and come straight to him and ask a very brief question, because in about 10 minutes we're going to have to whisk him away. If you have any questions about our organization, you can look for any of us with the staff name tag on, which I don't have. If you have our website is mspolicy.org. Also seethespending.org, where you can see how your tax money is being spent. If you have any other questions about our work, we'll be happy to talk to you about it. Otherwise, thank you for coming. You're dismissed.
That was a great thing. We had so much good.